had just folded the last of the laundry when the knock came at the door. It wasn't loud, not even urgent, but something about it unsettled me. My husband, Mark, was out of town for a work conference. The children were at their grandmother's, and I was supposed to have the house to myself for the evening. Peaceful, predictable. That's the thing about life. Though, it rarely asks permission before it changes everything. When I opened the door, I froze. Standing there, drenched lightly from the sudden drizzle outside, was Daniel. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, not since our college years when he'd been the boy who made me laugh at inappropriate moments, and who, without trying, showed me what it felt like to be truly noticed. Back then, I'd chosen someone else, Mark, the man who offered me stability, promises of a safe future, and a kind of steady love that seemed unshakable. I had convinced myself it was the right choice. But seeing Daniel again was like colliding with a version of myself I thought had vanished. His hair had silvered at the temples, his jawline was sharper, and his smile carried a weight it hadn't before. Yet his eyes, the same deep brown that once read me better than I could read myself, were unchanged. "Rachel," he said softly, testing my name as if to be sure it still belonged to me. I could barely breathe. I had rehearsed countless conversations in my head over the years, imagined what I'd say if I ever saw him again. But now that the moment had arrived, I had nothing. Just a thundering heart and 1,000 unspoken memories. He shifted awkwardly, his hand brushing back wet strands of hair. "I was passing through town. I thought, maybe I'd see if you were still here." Still here. As if I hadn't moved on, hadn't built a life filled with schedules, obligations, and a husband who never forgot to kiss my forehead before leaving for work. As if the girl he once knew was still waiting for him in the shadows of who I'd become. I should have told him it wasn't a good time. I should have closed the door with a polite smile, protecting the fragile order of the life I had chosen. But instead I stepped aside. "Come in," I whispered, though part of me already knew I was inviting more than just an old friend into my home. The air between us felt charged, almost dangerous as Daniel crossed the threshold. And in that moment, I realized the storm outside wasn't the only one I would have to face. Daniel's presence in my living room felt like a ripple in still water, disrupting the carefully arranged calm of my life. I perched on the edge of the sofa, hands folded in my lap, while he leaned casually against the armchair, as if he had been there 100 times before. The familiarity unsettled me. "I should tell you about my husband, Mark. He is a good man, kind, loyal, steady. He works long hours in finance, the type of man who organizes his day in neat columns and keeps promises like they are sacred. He is the father of my children, the reason we own this comfortable home with sunlit windows and a well-tended garden. By all appearances, I should be content. And yet contentment can be deceptive. It can quietly turn into emptiness, a silence that grows louder with every passing year. Mark and I still share the rituals of marriage, coffee in the mornings, small kisses at the door, polite questions about each other's days. But somewhere along the way, our love became functional, stripped of fire. He loves me, I know he does, but it's a love that runs on schedule, never daring to spill beyond the lines. And though I never confessed it aloud, I had begun to feel invisible, more wife and mother than woman. Daniel was the opposite. Even in college, he had been chaos wrapped in charm. Where Mark saw the world as numbers and plans, Daniel saw it as possibilities. He laughed too loudly, loved too recklessly, and made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He was the temptation I never let myself touch, the path I turned away from in search of safety. And yet, seeing him now, I realized how thin that safety felt. He broke the silence first. "You look happy. At least, I hope you are." I forced a smile. "I have a good life, Daniel." He studied me, his gaze unflinching, as if he could see the cracks I worked so hard to hide. "But is it the life you wanted?" The question cut deeper than I expected. I thought of the nights Mark stayed late at the office, of the empty conversations, of the way I sometimes stared at the ceiling, wondering if this was all marriage was meant to be. I thought of the girl I had been when Daniel and I nearly crossed a line years ago, and how that girl had vanished into routine. I made my choices. I answered finally, my voice steady but my chest tight. He nodded slowly, though his eyes told me he heard what I wasn't saying. Outside, rain streaked down the glass, soft and relentless. Inside, the silence between us felt heavier, laden with the weight of years and roads not taken. And in that moment, I knew. Daniel hadn't just walked back into my house. He had walked back into the part of me I had buried long ago. The rhythm of conversation with Daniel was disarming. 1 minute we were recalling harmless memories, late-night study sessions, a road trip that ended with a flat tire and laughter under the stars. And the next, the air between us thickened with everything we hadn't said back then. "Do you ever think about those days?" he asked, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Sometimes," I admitted, though the word carried far more weight than I wanted. Sometimes was an understatement. I had thought about him more times than I dared confess, usually in the quiet spaces of my marriage, when the house was still and my mind drifted. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. I used to wonder what would have happened if we hadn't stopped ourselves. If you hadn't walked away. The words hit me harder than I expected. I could feel my pulse quicken, the room suddenly warmer. "Daniel, that was years ago. We were kids. Life doesn't happen in what-ifs. And yet," he said softly, "here we are, still wondering." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Outside, the rain drummed steadily against the windows, a rhythm that seemed to echo the racing of my heart. Mark's face flashed in my mind, the steady comfort of him, the loyalty, the promises we had built a life upon. But when I looked at Daniel, I felt something Mark hadn't stirred in me for years, a raw, unfiltered hunger to be seen. He shifted closer, not enough to touch, but enough to blur the line between memory and present. "Rachel," he whispered, my name carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. I should have asked him to leave. Every rational part of me screamed it, but instead I stayed frozen in that charged space, torn between the life I had and the life that might have been. His hand brushed mine, tentative, almost accidental. The contact was brief, but it set off sparks that surged through me. I inhaled sharply, the sound betraying me. "Tell me to stop," he said, eyes locked on mine. But I didn't. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to. In that moment, surrounded by the storm outside and the storm within me, I realized the central conflict wasn't Daniel versus Mark. It was me, caught between the woman I had become and the woman I once was, both demanding to be heard. I looked at him, every nerve alive, and whispered the words that sealed what was already happening. "Don't stop." The moment I told Daniel not to stop, something inside me shifted. It was as if the boundaries I had built over 12 years of marriage, walls of loyalty, vows, and reason, crumbled with a single breath. He leaned in, slowly at first, as though giving me one last chance to change my mind. But I didn't move. When his lips touched mine, it was like being pulled into a current. I no longer had the strength to fight. The kiss wasn't reckless. Not at first. It was soft, searching, layered with all the words we had never said. Then it deepened, urgent, like we were trying to reclaim every lost year. My hands trembled against him, not from fear but from recognition. This wasn't new. It was old, unfinished, revived with terrifying clarity. "Rachel," he whispered, his forehead pressed to mine. I've imagined this 1,000 times, but it's nothing compared to this. His words should have jolted me awake, reminded me of Mark, of the children, of the life upstairs waiting for me in family portraits and neatly folded laundry. Instead, they fueled the ache. Because I understood him. I had imagined it too. We pulled apart only when breath demanded it. I stared at him, my chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, my conscience screaming and my body betraying me. "This is wrong," I managed, though my fingers still clung to his shirt. He nodded, but his eyes burned with defiance. "Then why does it feel so right?" That question tore me apart. Because it did feel right, terribly, beautifully right. For years, I had carried myself as though desire was a chapter closed. With Mark, intimacy had become predictable, an obligation tucked neatly between work deadlines and bedtime stories. But Daniel awakened something reckless, something I thought I had outgrown. We didn't rush further, though the air between us was charged with possibility. Instead, we sat there, holding on to each other, silently acknowledging the enormity of what we had done. At last, reality intruded. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with Mark's name and a message. On my way home. Can't wait to see you. The words were a dagger. Guilt surged, bitter and immediate, threatening to drown out the sweetness of the moment. I pulled back, my hands trembling. I can't, I whispered, shaking my head. This, whatever this is, it can't continue. Daniel's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. He only cupped my face gently, his thumb brushing away the tear I hadn't realized had fallen. I know, but I had to see you. I had to know if it was still real, and I couldn't deny it. It was real, too real. As he stood to leave, the silence was suffocating. Every step he took toward the door felt like a fracture in my chest. He paused once, his hand on the knob, and looked back. You'll always wonder, Rachel. Just like I always did. Then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and I was left alone with the echo of my choices. The house was quiet after Daniel left, yet nothing about the silence felt ordinary. I could still taste him on my lips, still feel the ghost of his touch lingering on my skin. The storm outside had eased into a drizzle, but inside me, the storm was only beginning. Minutes later, Mark came home. He stepped through the same door Daniel had walked out of, carrying the faint scent of rain and hotel soap. His tie was loosened, his smile soft, familiar. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, the same way he always did, a gesture of routine rather than passion. Missed you, he said warmly, setting down his suitcase. I swallowed hard, forcing my lips to curve into a smile. Missed you too. The words were true, but they carried a heaviness I couldn't explain. For years, I had thought of Mark as the anchor of my life, the man who steadied me when everything else felt uncertain. And he still was, steady, reliable, safe. But after Daniel, I couldn't deny that part of me longed for something less certain. Something wild and uncontained. That night, as Mark slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts unraveling. Guilt clawed at me, sharp and merciless. I had crossed a line I swore I never would. Yet beneath the guilt was another truth, quieter but undeniable. Daniel had awakened a part of me I didn't even realize was starving. I thought about his final words. You'll always wonder. He was right, I would. Even if I never saw him again, even if I buried this encounter beneath layers of daily life, the wondering would remain. Infidelity, I realized, isn't always about love or lust. Sometimes it's about absence, the absence of being truly seen, of being touched not just out of habit but out of hunger. With Daniel, I felt like the woman I used to be. With Mark, I was the woman I had promised to become, and both truths coexisted inside me, colliding with every breath. By morning, the world had returned to normal. I packed school lunches, brewed coffee, listened to the hum of ordinary life. Mark kissed me goodbye, and the children filled the house with laughter. On the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. I don't know if I'll ever tell Mark what happened. I don't know if I'll ever see Daniel again. Perhaps this was nothing more than a collision of past and present, a reminder of roads not taken. Or perhaps it was the beginning of a reckoning I've long avoided. What I do know is this. Life rarely waits for permission before it shifts. Sometimes it takes one unexpected knock, one moment of weakness, to remind us that even the strongest vows carry their shadows. And as I stood at the window, watching the last drops of rain fade from the glass, I understood that the real story wasn't about Daniel or even Mark. It was about me, the choices I made, the truths I discovered, and the questions I'll carry for the rest of my life.